4. At 3 a.m, we stopped at a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. By the middle of nowhere, I mean the middle of nowhere. The gas station was the only building in the area, and it was surrounded by empty fields. It was maybe 2 miles off of the interstate. At 3 a.m, it was pitch black outside, and the lights at the gas station were the only thing that illuminated the area. Since the gas station was closed, we were the only people there. My husband filled up the Jeep and we spent a few minutes rummaging through our bags because I couldn't find my purse. Turns out I had left it in a relative's car in Chicago. Whoops. After a while, an SUV pulled up right next to us. The driver was a white man in his late 20s or early 30s. At that point, I was sitting in the passenger seat and my husband was about to get into the driver's seat. The man approached my husband and said, "I lost my phone here. Have you seen it?" Suddenly, a sense of dread filled the pit of my stomach as I noticed that he already had a phone, a flip phone on his hip. I studied his face. While he looked unassuming, there was something off about him, something sinister. "I must have left it in the field over there," he said. The field was pitch black. "Can you help me look for it?" My husband already had his iPhone out with the flashlight on. He's such a good Samaritan. He started to follow the man. I whipped out my phone and texted him, "Leave." My husband immediately saw the text and looked at me. I must have looked terrified because he ran, jumped into the car and we booked it out of there. As we were leaving, I looked back and saw the man get into his car. We drove for about 20 miles on the interstate to a rest stop and slept there. After a short time, my husband woke me up and told me to look through the passenger side window. The man had pulled up right next to us. There were some empty parking spaces at the rest stop, and he still parked next to us. The creepy part is that we were parked at the very end of the rest stop, and the spot next to us wasn't even a parking space. We had our seats down to help us sleep, so he probably didn't see us in our Jeep. We quietly watched him get out of his car, look over our Jeep, and walk into the building, probably looking for us. As soon as he entered the building, we snapped our seats back up and hauled ass out of there. We drove for about 50 miles and found a hotel about 6 miles north of the interstate. We never saw him again.
Number 3.
I grew up in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. When I was younger, our town used to get feet upon feet of icy white snow that glistened like diamonds in the sun. Snowmobiles have always been a huge part of my childhood, and I've been riding them for as long as I can remember. My father and I would take the sled out every time we had the chance, which was usually every weekend, or weekend if the ground was still white. Because we were so addicted to the thrill of driving fast down vast, sometimes blinding trails, my father spent a decent amount of time and money customizing his sled. We had a Firecat. As I was very young at this time, I really don't have any other information on the snowmobile, but I remember driving it before this incident and overheating it because I drove it too slow. It was a fast beast of a machine, and we would often take it off jumps and bluffs throughout the off-trails. At this time, I was too big to sit between my father's arms with my hands on the steering wheel, so I would ride passenger on the seat behind my father, holding on to him to prevent from flying off. I remember it was St. Patrick's Day, and there was a freak snowstorm the night before. We rarely had snow this late into the year, and so, being the fanatics we were, my dad took the day off work, allowed me to take the day off school, and we took the Firecat out for her last journey of the year. We left while the sun was still low, hoping to make the most of the entire day. We initially took our familiar trails, enjoying the warm air and sun in our suits. Eventually, my father decided to take a trail he had not seen before. It was mostly hidden by small birchlings and went down a somewhat winding path through a thickening forest. We loved anything that gave us an overload of nature's beauty, so he absent-mindedly took the unknown trail. At this point, the sun was high in the clear blue sky. We had already stopped for gasoline twice, stopping for coffee and donuts as well. The snow began to melt, and the trail was more of a deep boggy brown than it was white. Other snowmobilers had the same idea as we did: get on the trail for the last time of the season. Technically, the season had already ended that year. This was a bonus day to ride. As we continued down the path, we realized that the sled was trudging through the mud. Patches of the trail contained pools of dark, icy water. We continued on, being the stubborn fools that we were, veiled by curiosity. The puddles began to expand though. Each one was larger than the one before, and at one point, the water had splashed up over the side of the machine and wet my boots. The trees around us got denser, until we could no longer see anything beyond the shadows of its branches. After about half an hour of slowly navigating through the maze of mud and twigs, we came upon a group of snowmobilers, covered from head to toe in mud, resting at the entrance of a huge body of water. The puddle took up the entire trail and stretched into the distance by a good 200 yards. My father and I stopped and greeted the four gentlemen on the idle snowmobiles. He exchanged pleasantries about the snow and the weather and asked the man in the green suit, "Is it safe to cross?" The green man paused for a moment. None of them had removed their helmets. He cracked his visor just enough for us to see his chin and bottom lip. He smiled. "Oh yeah, man, you've got a Firecat. You can make that for sure." My dad laughed and nodded. We inched our way to the water. Usually, for shallow puddles, we drove slow as not to splash slushy water up onto our boots, or shoot it at any unfortunate people that happened to be behind us. As we crept through the water, the levels began to rise higher and higher. Before my father knew it, the snowmobile, it was beginning to sink. He pinned the throttle, but to no avail. We were going under. The back end of the snowmobile began to sink first, which is where I was sitting. I would like to mention that I was a very small child. I looked more like the size of a 6-year-old rather than an 8 or 9. I had a bright hot pink puffy snowsuit on and a bright yellow snowmobile helmet. There was no way that these men on the trail didn't notice a child on the back of my father's sled. My father tried not to panic. He quickly stood up and carefully lifted me to stand on top of the seat so I wouldn't get wet. He turned back to the 4 men on the trail and threw his arms up in a kind of gesture of, "Hey, what do you do?" He expected them to try to help, but instead we could distinctly see Green Man's shoulders shake as he laughed at us. He then directed his crew to follow him as he turned around and drove away. My father's hands dropped to his sides. We stood in silence for a moment. The snowmobile was still sinking. We realized that this was no puddle. The runoff from the melted snow had flooded the trail. We were basically sinking into a pond. At this point, the entire back end of the machine was underwater. The hood stood afloat, so the deep glugging from the exhaust underwater filled the silence around us. The lights on the snowmobile began to flicker, and we saw, to our dismay, the front end start to sink as well. My father panicked. He had a cell phone in the front pocket of his snowsuit, but he doubted that he'd get coverage out here. The snow may have been melting, but it was still only about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, and chunks of ice attacked our machine as they dragged it into the abyss. He knew my snowsuit wasn't going to protect me from hypothermia, so he picked me off of the sinking sled and attempted to put me on a bent sapling so I could balance above the water. While moving, my father lost his footing and we both fell into the painfully cold water. I was able to grab the sapling and pull myself onto its horizontal body, so only my legs got wet. My dad fell backwards and nearly fully submerged himself from impact. He jumped back and mistakenly grabbed onto the sled, which now sit dead in his hands. He threw his helmet off of his head into the water and ripped open his jacket to find his wet cell phone. When he looked at me, I saw fear in his eyes. "We have to walk, kiddo," he said quietly. "We have to go forward. We are closer to the end than we are the beginning. We have to walk through the water quick as you can, okay?" I started to cry then. The tears stung as they froze to my cheeks. My helmet didn't have a visor, so other than a wet cloth mask, my face was exposed to the elements. I nodded and took his hand. He walked through the icy cold water and bent saplings along the way so I could walk on them. The water stretched vastly on either side of us. We walked for a couple of yards when the pond opened up. The water was shallow here, but it was muddy, sticky, and there was nothing to walk on. My father lifted me up on his shoulders and began walking with me, but he continued to trip and slip as his feet sloped in the thick mud under the water. At one point, my father's foot caught on a fallen tree hidden in the darkness below. He fell forward, basically throwing me like a football. He landed face first into the water and struggled to maintain his composure. My butt hit the water first, and I was able to get to my feet relatively quickly. Behind me, I heard my father struggling to get to his feet and heard him call to me. "Just keep going, kiddo. Keep walking. You're almost there. You can do it. I'm right behind you." I didn't hesitate. I began to wade through the waist-deep water toward the shore that was mere feet away from me now. The sticky mud threatened to steal my boots with every step. Finally, I heard splashing behind me and felt my father put his hand on my shoulder and urge me to move faster. He was basically half dragging me through the pond when it happened. The mud won. I lost my left boot and it took my sock with it. I screamed at my father, but he knew that we couldn't go back. His fingers were beginning to lose its grip on my wrist, and I was getting very, very tired. Finally, he pulled me on shore and winced as I cried when my frozen foot hit muddy snow. He took off his wet glove and wrung it out before shoving it uncomfortably on my foot. He tried to spread my toes through a couple of the fingers so it would fit, but my toes were balled up like a fist and were frozen that way. The air was getting colder the longer we walked through the unfamiliar forest. I noticed ice crystals clinging to my father's crunchy snowsuit, and no doubt my own as well. He was carrying me, but his entire body ached, and he couldn't do it anymore. He could barely carry his own weight, let alone mine, so he let me use his arm as a crutch and half dragged me for what seemed like hours. I could no longer feel my foot at this point, and I was having a hard time keeping my eyes open. Suddenly, my father jerked me forward forcefully. He began sprinting. I had a hard time keeping up and began to cry for him to slow down. He didn't listen. In fact, I think he sped up. At some point, he had regained his strength and had picked me up and effortlessly threw me over his shoulder like a rucksack. I was confused until I saw it. A clearing, a road, a house. The house was an old farmhouse, and honestly, I thought it was abandoned. My father marched right up to the front door and banged on it furiously. An elderly woman answered the door, and before my father could even speak, ushered us inside the house. She sat us in front of a fireplace and threw thick, scratching wool blankets over our shoulders. We didn't complain. My father began to tell the woman our story. I could finally feel my foot again, but now my body stung as if it was on fire. Every inch of my exposed skin felt like it was being licked by the flames in the fireplace. The woman's husband came home with the only family vehicle, and he drove my father and I straight to the hospital. I had severe pneumonia, and was undergoing the first stages of hypothermia. My foot recovered, but I had to stay in the hospital for a few days. My father was released a couple of hours later and went home to tell the family what had happened and bring me some of my personal items. He put an article in the newspaper telling the exact story of what had happened and a very specific description of the 4 snowmobilers that left us for dead. He had hoped someone would come to him with information, but we never heard anything. The following day, while my mother visited me in the hospital, my father and a couple of his friends took some ATVs back into the trail to pull out the snowmobile. After an entire afternoon of attempts, the Firecat was finally freed from her icy prison. My father had towed it home, and it sat for 2 weeks in the garage. He said that we had probably walked at least 20 minutes after the sled sunk before we found the couple that saved us. I was released from the hospital a couple of days later. I felt much better, but was a little nervous about going on a snowmobile again. My mother dropped me off at my father's house, and I found him in the garage, working on the Firecat. He would eventually get it to start and run almost perfectly. We used it the following 3 seasons, before selling it one summer.
Number 2.
This didn't happen to me. However, I did witness the incident, and it creeps me out to this day. Back in junior high school, there was this popular kid named Ryan that used to bully me and tons of other people in our school. Ryan was the type of kid that thought that he was the best in the world because he was the captain of the football team. The kid that bullied nerds and cheated on his girlfriends. You know the type. Ryan's father ran an automotive parts store. His specialty was paint jobs and window tinting. He had many vehicles, but his favorite was a dark blue truck with orange and yellow flames on the front. It also had tinted windows and spinning hubcaps on the wheels. Ryan's father often wore the same team jersey as his son's team jersey, a red and white hat and blue jeans. As we continue the story, you will soon discover why the details of this particular truck, as well as its owner, are very important. One day, on my way to my next class, I fell down the stairs and sprained my ankle. I ended up limping to the nurse's office and calling my dad to come pick me up. After that, I sat in the waiting area looking out for my dad's car. About 5 minutes after I left the nurse's office, Ryan walked into the waiting area and sat down. Bored out of his mind, Ryan decided to talk to me while we were waiting for our dads to pick us up. I guess he felt safe talking to a nerd since his friends weren't around. So, I begrudgingly decided to be polite with him and made small talk. About 5 or so minutes later, Ryan looked out the glass doors and saw his father pulling into the entrance of the school. Ryan said, "See you later, man," picked up his backpack and headed towards the glass doors. He was about to push the door open when he suddenly stopped and paused. When I asked him what was wrong, Ryan explained to me that his father usually picked him up later and that he usually parked his truck right next to the glass doors. Instead, Ryan's dad was 20 minutes early. The truck was next to the flagpoles, which were much further away, and the hubcaps appeared to be different and didn't even spin. After a few minutes of this, Ryan's cell phone then went off. Ryan at this point simply assumed that it was his dad calling and didn't pick it up. So he walked out the door and headed towards the truck. I decided to take a nap while I waited for my own dad to pick me up. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like an older man yelling and Ryan screaming. I looked out the window only to see Ryan flailing his arms and an older man trying to pull him into the truck. Because of my ankle, I couldn't run to Ryan's aid, so I shouted to the nurse as well as to the other staff members to get help. One of the nurses immediately called the police. A couple of secretaries ran towards the truck to help Ryan. Upon seeing the secretaries running towards him, the creep shoved Ryan away and climbed further into his truck. The guy then sped off and disappeared into the intersection that led into a nearby highway. Ryan at this point was crying in pain, mainly because the guy had pepper sprayed him. The secretaries helped poor Ryan to his feet and guided him to the nurse's office. About a few minutes later, the police, along with Ryan's real father, arrived. The police, as well as an ambulance, tended to Ryan while a couple of police officers interviewed me and the other witnesses. Because I was the only student that witnessed this, the police, as well as Ryan's dad, asked me to stay in touch and hang out with Ryan, just so that he could have a shoulder to lean on and recover emotionally. So, I swallowed my pride and gave Ryan my phone number. From that day forward, Ryan was a completely different person. The same person who used to body slam me into lockers was now in constant fear and used my body as a shield instead of a punching bag. There wasn't a day at school where Ryan wasn't around me. He was especially clingy and paranoid when it came to having his dad pick him up. I would have to hold his hand and stay there with him until his dad came around. It even got to the point that Ryan would call me every night to vent his fears, as well as update me on what the police would find. And many of the details about this were very, very creepy. For instance, the creep, whoever he was, not only knew where Ryan went to school and where he got picked up, he even knew which vehicle Ryan's dad drove whenever he picked up his son from school. So he decided to imitate everything about Ryan's father. That's right, the creep actually went through the trouble of painting his own truck the same colors as the father's, just to fool and lure Ryan. He even dressed up like Ryan's dad. Ryan even said to me that the disguise was so convincing that it wasn't until he looked the creep in the eye that he realized that he wasn't his father. Yet things got even creepier the more Ryan told me and the more the police department found. As it turns out, the creep also knew Ryan's cell phone number, but wasn't the one who called Ryan. Ryan told me that the police said the mysterious number belonged to a payphone at a nearby gas station, so the creep in the truck couldn't have possibly called Ryan, meaning that not one but two people may have been involved in this. Despite having video surveillance, a license plate, and a description of the driver, the police never found the guy or his gas station buddy. And even then, the creep continued to terrorize Ryan and his dad. About 3 months after the truck incident, Ryan called me in the middle of the night, this time in hysterics. Someone had thrown several Molotov cocktails at Ryan's house. A couple of them even hit and shattered a window and set a part of his house on fire. About a month after the Molotov cocktails were thrown, someone, most likely the same creep, set fire to Ryan's father's business. Ryan and his father moved out of the area not long after. The creep also disappeared, leaving everyone else to wonder just who that creep was. Was the creep a disgruntled parent or relative of a student that Ryan bullied? Was he the enraged parent or relative of one of Ryan's many ex-girlfriends? Was he a dissatisfied customer of Ryan's father? Or was he just some random creep that liked to terrorize teenage boys? The possibilities as to who this guy was and why he, as well as his accomplice, would target Ryan were endless. With Ryan now gone, I quickly found myself getting very frightened over the possibility of the same creep coming after me. For a long time, I was super paranoid about the creep coming after me and subjecting me to even worse terror than Ryan had experienced. From that day forward, I refused to be picked up from school, no matter how sick or hurt I was. All because I feared that some creep was going to do the same thing to me. Even to this day, the whole incident sends shivers down my spine.
Number 1.
I work at a big-name retail company in the United States. I've been at my store for going on 9 years now, so as you can imagine, I have a good amount of friends who work in the building. This story happened about 3 years ago, before I became a manager, but pretty far into my career in the building. During the holiday season, we hire on a lot of seasonal team members. Some stay and some go. Amongst the new faces in the building was a younger guy called Matt. For his age, Matt had an amazing work ethic, going as far as to ski into work during a bad snowstorm rather than call out. I was told that he was an Eagle Scout, member of the Honor Society all through school. He was a weird kid, loner type, but he seemed to take to me pretty quickly. The department I worked in was towards the back of the store, and he was a backroom team member, so we saw a lot of each other. We chatted about things like video games and comics, mostly passing chatter. Have you played blank yet? It's amazing. That type of thing. Before long, he was adopting my break schedules, mostly to bum cigarettes. Matt ended up staying after the season ended, so I had a pretty consistent smoke buddy. One morning in January, he asked me if I knew someone called Jack. He went to the high school I graduated from, but both Matt and Jack were considerably younger than me. I told him I didn't know him. "Oh, okay," he said. "I was just asking because a friend asked me to deal with him. I'm kind of a protector in my circle and he's been messing with her." I brushed it off, mostly just surprised by the fact that he had friends outside of his work bubble. The next day, he came to me again, talking about Jack. "I figured out where he lived, but there are so many cars in his driveway, I'm not sure which one is his. I need to be sure he's home, or if I do something, it's to his car." This sketched me out a bit, but being a semi-sane person, I assumed he was going to pull a childish prank. Still, I lied. "Be careful in that area. My dad lives there and there's a lot of vandalism. Most homeowners have surveillance cameras out front." He didn't seem fazed by my statement and switched the conversation to the then new Zelda game. About a month or so had passed with no new inquiries or comments about Jack or his mission. I was relieved. I showed up to work as usual, and around 9:45 I took my smoke break. Matt usually worked later, so my first break was usually a solo one. But that day, he covered a shift. I was surprised when he followed me out and asked for a cigarette. I gave it to him and sat down to enjoy my break. "So I finally got that kid." The way he said it, it sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, okay. Well, I beat Zelda last night. It's a good game. You should get it." I tried to change the subject, but I could see he was going to continue talking. "Do you know what ricin is?" I admit I hadn't, so I shook my head. I wish I could say I still don't. For those of you who also don't know, from what I'm told, ricin is a particularly deadly poison with no scent or taste that, when ingested, can be lethal within 3 days. Not a Breaking Bad fan, I guess? I shook my head again, but by then he was already rattling on about how to make it and what it did. "It's lethal, odorless and tasteless. No antidote either. I put it on a scratch and sniff card and walked it to his house last night. His birthday was recently, so he shouldn't be surprised by it." Right away, a million thoughts rushed into my head. I come from a large, close family. If I had a card in my mailbox, hand-addressed and without a return address on it, I know for a fact that one of my siblings or parents would have opened it. As much as I wanted to believe that he was just trying to sound like a badass, I couldn't bring myself to leave that to chance. I pretended I hadn't heard him, continued my Zelda talk and headed back in. Once inside, I alerted my direct superior and sat in an office to call the police. 2 plainly clothed detectives came in shortly after and questioned me pretty extensively. They agreed that it was more than likely not true, but were glad I reported it regardless and were on their way. Matt worked through the rest of his shift and left with another backroom team member. Shortly after they left, the detectives returned. The card that was in the mailbox had something in it, but they couldn't be sure what it was. It had to go to a lab for testing. They went to Matt's house and talked to him. He said that he put powder in the card to try and scare him, and that was it. The next week was crazy. The lab results came back positive for a particular potent batch of ricin. Matt attempted to flee his home while a hazmat team knocked on the door. He hid the remaining poison in a storm drain close by, where it was quickly found. Matt was arrested, and I planned on going back to my normal life. Not the case, though. News reporters and journalists were at my job, my home, and both of my parents' homes daily. I had to wear another girl's name badge, so they didn't know who I was. But they knew. They would come back to my department, referring to me in third person and trying to pet my ego. It didn't work. I had very clear directions to not discuss the incident. Besides, I wanted to be done with the whole situation. My dickhead, now ex-boyfriend, kicked me out because of the reports and police. I just wanted to go back to being normal. I met with the family of the would-be victim. The mother and father were very nice, thanking me and crying. The mum had painted me an angel as a thank you gift, and though I'm not religious, I've held on to it. The brother was a paraplegic with a seizure disorder. He couldn't take care of himself at all. The sister, who was opening the mailbox as the police called the house, was a 2-time cancer survivor, and Jack, the eldest, was there with his girlfriend. It turns out the reason Matt tried to kill Jack was because he was dating an ex of his. That's absolutely insane to me, but clearly this kid was not the most sane. I met with them a few times for trial prep, all scheduled works in advance, all fairly redundant. Until one day, I got a call very late from a woman I'd never talked to before. She was with a victims protection agency, and she needed to meet with me at the courthouse the following morning. In the room was myself, the family, the original DA and detectives, as well as a new DA and a new set of detectives. They passed around a photocopy of a letter handwritten from Matt to another inmate who was due to be released soon. I can't remember exactly what was written, but there were very graphic, disturbing plans for each of us. He offered up a trust fund that may or may not exist, leaning towards not since he was using a public defender to beat an attempted murder charge. If the other inmate did things like kidnap our families and burn them on our lawns while we watched from inside the house, remove our tongues and eyelids and force us to drink bleach. There was a distinct plan for each of us, but like I said, I don't remember most of it. He's since been sentenced and sent upstate. His trial seemed to go on forever, finally ending a few months ago. I don't think he's been charged for the second case, the threatening letter to the other inmate, just yet. But I'm not supposed to go to those trials, so I may never know.